can't promise you that I'll go all the way until 8 o'clock, but I did learn a good while ago that when you're finished saying what you need to say, stop talking. So, and those are the kinds of things we generally don't learn the easy way. I had several good English and literature teachers throughout my schooling. Probably one of the most difficult was my own mother. Growing up with a 30-year school teacher will cause you to fear school teachers to a certain extent. But at any rate, any time that we ever had a composition to write in one of her classes, which I have to tell you that having a parent for a school teacher is one of the worst experiences that anyone can ever endure. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, I'll hold your hand and cry with you later. Because 10 times more is expected of you than of any other student that's in there. But the one thing that really got drilled in my head was that when you're done writing something, when you're done with something, just shut your mouth. It's a whole lot better that way. So, at any rate, notwithstanding, I'm going to pull two things out of my wallet. One is a $20 bill, and one is a $5 bill. Excuse me? I think not. You're what these are really worth, Hank. Just stay tuned. Stay tuned. All right. Does anybody know what it takes the Federal Reserve, cost-wise, to manufacture a $20 bill and a $5 bill? Good answer. How much of it? Is it $100 a piece? Is it a penny a piece? What do we think? Which one costs more to manufacture, do you think? The 5? What makes you say that? Just a guess? Okay. It's counterintuitive, so I just kind of wondered. I thought maybe you did your Google research like I did before I came in. This guy here, the $5 bill, costs about 10.9 cents for the Federal Reserve to manufacture. This one is 10.6 cents. Well, that's interesting. So what makes this one worth more than what this one does? And all of a sudden, we start to see where we're going with this. Well, I'm going to talk about the three descriptors of purpose, identity, and value. Or if you need an acronym, I deliberately did that backwards. It is VIP if you read it backwards, value, identity, purpose. In any case, identity is still in the middle, and that's still the most critical thing. So if I was to ask you, what is your identity? What kind of things would we base our answers on? And especially with the missions conference coming up, I'd love to hear what people from foreign countries and from different ethnicities and cultural groups I'd love to hear how they answer that question, and I'd love to know what they base that on. Because, for instance, if we were to ask an Irish person, what's your identity? Irish, probably, a lot. Somebody from India might be Indian. They might also relate to a belief system that they have. We in America have a little difficult time with that, though, because we have such a diverse culture. We don't all look the same. We certainly don't all talk the same. Even within West Virginia, there's a Coalfield, West Virginia accent, and there's a Panhandle, West Virginia accent, and the twain shall never meet, not without some kind of discrimination, at any rate. And so, what's that? Or a gun? We'll leave those out in the truck. That's okay. So we have a lot of different things that we can base our identity on, but really at the core of who we are, we've got to have a very good, solid understanding of what our identity is. And so why is that? Well, identity is related to the purpose that we have. And identity, on the other side, is also related to the value that we have. So I could do one of two things with this. I could either go to Walmart and spend it on, I don't know, what's $20 at Walmart get you these days? It gets you a lot of candy. There we go. Doesn't get you a whole lot. I mean, it might get you a drill bit set if you like cheapy drill bits. And so I could do that with it, or it's also a real nice piece of paper, so I could blow my nose on it. I have my choice with what I do with this, don't I? I can use it one of two ways. I can use it for what it represents, or I could use it for what it physically feels like in my hands. That's some nice quality paper. It's got little red and blue fibers in that too. It'll look good. Wad it up in the trash if I misuse it. Don't we have the same option though with our lives though? Because you and I can choose our identity. If we go to the book of Ephesians, I think it's chapter 4 and verse 22. Let me double check before I misquote that. Yeah, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 22. Do we not have the ability to choose the identity that we use? Ephesians 4 and verse 22 says, to put off your old self, which belongs to the former manner of life and is corrupt through deceitful desires. And reading on to 23, to be renewed in the spirit of your minds. So you and I as Christian people have the ability to choose what, if you look into King James, it says to put off the old man. And so we have the ability to say, am I going to choose as my identity that who I was as a non-believer, or am I going to choose to identify with Christ and Christ crucified? So, interestingly enough, you and I get to choose what our identity is. Now, how often do we do that successfully? I almost hate to ask that question because I suspect the answer, if we're really honest with ourselves, the answer lies somewhere other than Ephesians 4:22. I myself am very guilty of not always doing that. You know, a lot of times we base our identity on rather shaky foundations. What's the world's identity of you? What does the world base their identity or their viewpoint of you? How does the world define that? It's usually one of two ways. It's either objects or other people. And by objects, I mean, how much worldly wealth do we have? What are our possessions? What have we accomplished? You know, the world looks at us and says, well, you know what? My bank account is 22.3% bigger than yours. Therefore, your identity is somewhat lesser than mine. The world looks at us and says, well, your house doesn't have brick on all sides. Your house just has brick on the front. You have vinyl siding on the back. What does that really mean? I mean, honestly, has anybody ever done a personal financial statement or a statement of your accomplishments? I challenge anybody that thinks that personal wealth means anything. Take yourself a little 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, just this size here, and write down your net worth. Write your assets, subtract your liabilities, and there's your net worth. And you know what? When you look at that, you're going to say, wow, everything I have fits on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. It doesn't matter if you have $10 or if you have $10 billion. It all fits on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So what does it truly matter, and how does it truly influence what you do with what's on that little sheet of paper? It absolutely doesn't. So we're on shaky ground if we're basing our identity on what we have or what we have accomplished, because that's ultimately a very selfish viewpoint of our identity. If we base our identity on what others think of us, that's perhaps even more shaky. I think of professional athletes. It's the first thing that my mind goes to when I think of how I view others in a context of approval or disapproval. When Peyton Manning was on his game, everybody said, man, he's just the greatest ever. But then when he started throwing some interceptions, they said, ooh, we're going to have to get some defense to go around him or we're not going to be very successful. And so when an athlete or anyone in the public sphere, and you and I can very easily be in the public sphere, even in our job, we can be in the public sphere in a daycare with, you know, how people see our kids act. I mean, there's any number of things that cause other people to look at us. And so what happens to our identity when everything is going right, when we're on the winning team, when we're on top of our game, when our muscles are the biggest and we've got it all together? Well, the crowd says that we're great, okay? But all of a sudden, things might change. We throw an interception. We're not very good at basketball after all, and the world finds out. So then what's the crowd's perception of us at that point? Pretty shabby. Yeah, I always found it interesting how many wealthy people, and again, let's look at the sports arena for that. How many wealthy people, when they leave that situation that they were in, all of a sudden their lives crash around them. I mean, dramatically so. 78% of NFL players are under, quote, severe financial stress within 2 years of retirement. They didn't even make it 5 years out of that. But you get used to the lifestyle. We like the lifestyle of the things that we have. We like our standard of living. We don't want it to go backwards. 40% of American workers have less than $10,000 saved for retirement. So unless we want to point fingers, let's remember that. And that's 40% of all American workers. This doesn't count people that don't have employment. This is people who are employed in the workforce. Only 60% have more than $10,000 saved up for the day when you're physically unable to perform your job again. So we better not base our identity on our things. We better not base our identity on what others think of us, because those are two very fluid concepts. They change dramatically. They change from day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute, really. Here's the question, though. What is our identity truly supposed to be based on? Well, here at Grace Gospel Church, we happen to have an answer for that. And I conveniently know exactly where to find that. Let's go to the book of Genesis for just a minute. Genesis chapter 1. And let's read verse 26. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26 says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness.'" Well, there's my first clue right there. My identity is similar to God's. Similar but different. We're made in his image. We're not made him, but we're made in his image. Interestingly enough, I said that the identity of an object or the identity of a person is based upon its purpose. A crescent wrench is different from a sledgehammer. So they do two different things. Sometimes we've confused the two, get mad at something and hit it with a sledgehammer. Could be a Chinese crescent wrench that you hit with a sledgehammer. Anybody ever get tools from Harbor Freight? So reading on in that verse, what do we see? We see a purpose for mankind. "And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heaven, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Now I know it's often said that the first command of God to mankind was to be fruitful and multiply. That's not true. The first command of God was our implicit created purpose that he gave to us, to have dominion over the earth. So what do we do if we have dominion over something? It doesn't mean that we domineer it. Even though that is from the same root word, the concept here is different. To have dominion over something means that we're responsible for it. If we're responsible for it, what happens ultimately that we have to do? We have to answer for what we did. We have to give an account. We're going to be held accountable for the dominion that we had that God has placed us over. So as caretakers, there's this drive that we have as human beings to learn about our world, to influence it, and ultimately, as we're starting to see in recent years, to protect it. And when any of those desires get out of balance with the other, that's when we do things that are detrimental to us. I always personally struggled with, I don't want to say I struggled with drivenness, but struggled with how do you balance Christianity and almost, I want to say, everyday life. How do we balance the New Testament, where the apostles literally gave every waking moment that they had to the spread of the gospel, with the pragmatic fact that we all got to eat dinner? Where does this come from? And it's a balancing act that each of us is ultimately responsible to figure out. But if we look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, this is a fairly obscure little passage, but it's one that just stuck in my mind at one point, and it just came back as I was studying through this evening. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and bear in mind that the writer here is probably not having one of his better days when he wrote this. There's a lot of cynicism that comes through in this. There's a lot of there's really a lot of meaninglessness that he's struggling with. I mean, I think today somebody would throw a pill at him and say, hey, you're fixed. But what he was really going through was an anguish about the meaning of life in general and working out his created purpose. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verse 4 says, "Then I saw that all toil and all skill in work comes from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after the wind." But I want you to remember the perspective that he has, because it's easy to look at this at face value and say, you know what, we shouldn't have any more than anyone else. We shouldn't learn more than anyone else. We shouldn't try harder than anyone else, because all it's doing is indicating how envious I am that somebody else might get ahead of me. That's not the perspective that I think is a proper biblical interpretation of this passage, because Solomon, if you read down through this, he is really struggling and wrestling with just everyday life matters. I would argue that the interest that we have as a human race in science and technology, the interest that we have in art, music, and literature, and the desire that we have for excellence does not actually stem from rivalry with someone else. Now, on an individual level, sure, there are people that I understand there are rivalries back and forth, but not necessarily unhealthy. The drive that we have to know our world, the drive that we have to understand it, to develop it, and to increase our standard of living does not come from jealousy. It instead comes from Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, where God said, "Let them have dominion over the earth." And having proper dominion over something means we learn about it, means we have a job to do, and it means that we are going to be held accountable for it. So that's one part of the purpose for our creation, and it's one very key leg to the identity that we are to have as Christian people. The second is in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28. It's the second command. "And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and again, have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." I would also argue that that exact same command, which was given to Adam and Eve, is also given to us as Christians. It was echoed by Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 to 20. Which just happens to be the Great Commission. "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." So essentially, we're commanded to reproduce after our own kind. Physically, Adam and Eve were commanded to reproduce, to literally fill the earth with physical human beings, you and I. And then spiritually, we're commanded to do the exact same thing. But notice that even that command is a twofold scenario, because God again told Adam to be fruitful, replenish the earth, but he also said, said again, he reiterated 2 verses later that we are to have dominion over the earth. So again, we're responsible for it. We're responsible for that which we create. We're responsible for that which is around us. And whether we made it or not, we're responsible to do something with it, and we'll be held accountable for how we did with that. And again, I see the same thing in Matthew chapter 28, where, for one, we're told to go therefore and make disciples. And then in verse 20, this is the dominion part, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. So it's one thing to reproduce, it's another thing to have dominion. And so the identity that we have is truly based on the twofold purpose that God created us to have dominion and to provide for the continuation of our physical and figurative species. Our physical species as human beings and our figurative group as disciples of Jesus Christ. So if it follows naturally that if we have such a high purpose and we have such a high identity, we can have such a high value as well, because purpose, identity, and value are intertwined. So if God's identity of us is so great that we can be considered his offspring, what is our value to God? I mean, it's unbelievable. So valuable that he absolutely held nothing back in reconciling us back to him. So the tricky thing, though, is what do we do with that? And how do we correctly present that concept to those who are not believers? Because if you really think about it, what we're asking people to do when we ask them to come to Christ or when we bring them to Christ and point to the true solution to their problem, are we asking them merely to ask Jesus for forgiveness of their sins? Are we asking them merely to say, to do the little 5-second prayer? Absolutely not. We're asking someone, we're presenting them with a choice to literally change their entire identity. That's a paradigm shift in the human mind. That is very difficult for people to do. And so when you and I, as followers of Christ, work with those who are not to bring forth fruit after our own kind, to talk like we're from Genesis, it's a very difficult job because without the Holy Spirit, it's impossible. It's absolutely an impossible task. But even here in America, with the missions conference coming up, it's easy to think that that's a scenario that people in other countries would face. We often hear of Muslims being cast out of their families and out of their ethnic groups because they've chosen to follow Christ. But in reality, if someone is so entrenched in the lifestyle that they have, if someone is so entrenched in sin without even knowing it, who are their friends? Other people doing the same thing. Who provides them with acceptance? Other people doing the same thing. What is their familiar situation? The places that they've all gone, the places that they like, familiar with, probably have some good memories there. So it's a lot more difficult. It's a whole lot more difficult for someone to truly change their identity from the inside out. But the truth of it is, to have the most value that we can, we have to understand that with human souls, we're dealing with the same problem that the Federal Reserve deals with these notes right here. If we look at the identity of the bills, it's worth $5 on the surface. If I change the identity and only look at the little 10-cent scrap of paper that's sitting on the desk right there, it's worth a whole lot less. So based on whether or not someone will choose to live out their purpose, that changes the identity and it changes the value of who we are. We have the ability to choose our own identity because we have the ability to choose to live out our purpose or to reject it entirely. When we choose to accept our purpose, our value increases to the maximum that it could possibly be, because our value is not based on my flesh and blood or your flesh and blood, the chemical elements that make us up. It's about $104 worth of chemical elements that make up the average human body. So we could live to please that flesh, which is worth $100 maybe, or we could live to please the Spirit, which is worth incredibly more, because God values us so greatly that he gave his Son for us, that we could not become his servants or not become his slaves, but that we could become his children and have an adequate, sufficient relationship with him. So we have a choice to make, and we can phrase it easily in terms that other people can understand. Who doesn't have a dollar bill or something in their wallet right now? You got a walking illustration with you at some point that's easy to use. I see some people saying, I don't have a dollar to my name. Use a quarter. Okay. What an opportunity we have to cast Christianity in the light that it's intended. That Christianity is not a set of rules to follow. It is not a set of regulations to live by. It's not strictly a relationship. It is truly how we achieve the most value and the greatest identity that we possibly can have as created beings loved by our Creator. And with that said, I believe I'm about finished, and so I'm going to stop talking right now.